Hollywood burns through cash like a wildfire. But some movies didn't just flop. They practically set entire studios on fire. We're talking about films that lost so much money. Executives got fired. Companies nearly went bankrupt, and careers were destroyed overnight. Did you know one movie on this list lost so much money, it literally ended an entire film studio's existence? Here are the 10 worst box office failures ever made. Mars Needs Moms, 2011. Disney spent $150 million on a movie that looked like it crawled out of an uncanny valley nightmare, and audiences said absolutely not. Mars Needs Moms was a motion capture animated film produced by Robert Zemeckis' Image Movers Digital, based on a Berkeley-breathed children's book. The story follows a young boy named Milo who chases after Martians that have kidnapped his mother. Sounds sweet, right? Problem is, the animation style made every character look like a wax figure that had been microwaved for 30 seconds. Critics were brutal. The motion capture technology that Zemeckis had championed in films like The Polar Express and Beowulf had already started wearing thin on audiences, and Mars Needs Moms was the final nail in that coffin. The film opened to a catastrophic $6.9 million on its opening weekend, one of the worst openings ever for a wide-release animated movie. By the end of its theatrical run, it had scraped together only $39 million worldwide against that $150 million budget. When you factor in marketing costs, the estimated loss was somewhere around $144 million. Disney shut down Image Movers Digital almost immediately after. Seth Green, who provided the motion capture for Milo, didn't even voice the character in the final film because producers decided his voice sounded too old. The kid's actual voice actor was then 12-year-old Seth Dusky. Roger Ebert called the film a dreary slog through a visually ugly landscape. It became a cautionary tale about how technology alone cannot save a bad idea, and it effectively killed the motion capture animation trend in Hollywood for good. The Lone Ranger, 2013. Johnny Depp put on face paint, rode a horse standing on its head, and Disney expected another Pirates of the Caribbean. They got a $225 million catastrophe instead. The Lone Ranger was supposed to be the next great franchise blockbuster, reuniting Depp with director Gore Verbinski and producer Jerry Bruckheimer. Instead, it became one of Disney's most infamous disasters. The production was plagued with problems from day one. Disney actually pulled the plug on the film at one point because the budget ballooned beyond control, only to greenlight it again after Depp and Verbinski agreed to trim costs. They didn't trim enough. The finished product clocked in at 2 hours and 29 minutes of bloated, tonally confused Western action. Critics savaged it. Armie Hammer, who played the actual Lone Ranger, was somehow outshined and sidelined in his own movie by Depp's eccentric Tonto. The casting of Depp as a Native American character drew intense backlash and accusations of cultural insensitivity, a controversy that followed the film from production through release. At the box office, The Lone Ranger earned only $260 million worldwide, which sounds decent until you realize Disney spent roughly $375 million on production and marketing combined. The estimated loss was around $160 million. Verbinski never directed another blockbuster of that scale again. Disney took a write-down of $160 to $190 million on the film. Bruckheimer's long-standing deal with Disney ended shortly after. One spectacular misfire essentially dismantled one of Hollywood's most powerful partnerships. Mortal Engines, 2018. Peter Jackson put his name on this thing, and audiences still didn't care. That's how you know something went terribly wrong. Mortal Engines was a visually stunning, wildly ambitious adaptation of Philip Reeve's novel about giant predator cities on wheels that consume smaller cities for resources. Jackson produced and co-wrote the screenplay, handing directing duties to his longtime visual effects collaborator, Christian Rivers, making his feature debut. Universal Pictures poured roughly $100 million into production, with total costs including marketing pushing well past $175 million. The trailers looked incredible. Giant moving cities crashing into each other, epic landscapes, a whole diesel punk aesthetic that felt genuinely fresh. But nobody showed up. The problem was simple but devastating. Nobody knew the source material. The marketing failed to create emotional connection with the characters, and audiences had franchise fatigue after years of Hobbit films that had diluted Jackson's brand. Opening weekend in North America was a disastrous $7.5 million. Worldwide, it managed only $83 million total. Universal reportedly lost somewhere around $174 million on the film. Critics were mixed, praising the visuals but finding the characters thin and the story predictable. Hugo Weaving delivered a solid villain performance that deserved a better movie around it. Hera Hilmar, a relatively unknown lead, couldn't carry the marketing campaign the way a bigger name might have. The film's failure essentially proved that Peter Jackson's name alone was no longer a guaranteed draw. A sobering reality check after the diminishing returns of the Hobbit trilogy. Rivers hasn't directed a feature film since. 47. Ronin, 2013. Keanu Reeves in a samurai epic sounded amazing on paper. On screen, it was a $175 million identity crisis. 47 Ronin was loosely based on the legendary true story of 47 masterless samurai in 18th century Japan who avenged their fallen master. Universal decided the best approach was to inject fantasy elements, CGI monsters, witches, and a fictional half-breed character played by Reeves into a story that didn't need any of it. Director Carl Rinch, a first-timer making his feature debut, reportedly clashed with the studio throughout production. Universal eventually took control of the edit, reshooting and recutting the film extensively. The result was a Frankenstein's monster of a movie that pleased absolutely no one. Fans of authentic Japanese history were turned off by the fantasy editions. Fantasy fans found it too slow and self-serious. The budget spiraled to roughly $175 million, and marketing pushed total costs toward $225 million. At the worldwide box office, 47 Ronin earned only $151 million. The estimated loss was around $149 million, making it one of the most expensive flops of 2013 in a year already crowded with megaflops. Critics pointed out that Reeves seemed oddly subdued, almost ghost-like, in a film that desperately needed energy and charisma. The movie holds a 16% on Rotten Tomatoes. Rinch essentially vanished from Hollywood after this, never directing another major studio project. Universal executives later admitted the film was a perfect storm of bad decisions, from casting to genre to budget management. Cutthroat Island, 1995. This is the movie that literally killed a studio. Not figuratively, actually, truly killed it dead. Cutthroat Island starred Geena Davis and Matthew Modine in a swashbuckling pirate adventure directed by Rennie Harlin, who was also Davis's husband at the time. Carolco Pictures, the studio behind massive hits like Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct, bet big on this one. The production was a disaster from the start. Michael Douglas was originally set to star but dropped out. Then several other actors passed before Modine signed on relatively late. The budget climbed past $100 million, which in 1995 was an absolutely staggering number for a pirate film. On release, Cutthroat Island opened to a humiliating $2.3 million in its opening weekend. It eventually earned roughly $10 million worldwide against that $100 million budget. Adjusted for inflation, it held the Guinness World Record for biggest box office bomb for years. The financial devastation was real and immediate. Carolco Pictures filed for bankruptcy. The studio that had once been a powerhouse of action cinema ceased to exist, and while Cutthroat Island wasn't the only reason, it was the final blow. Harlan's reputation as a blockbuster director never recovered. Davis, despite being a genuinely talented performer, saw her leading role opportunities dry up almost overnight in a brutal display of Hollywood's double standard. Critics called the film generic and loud. It became the poster child for Hollywood excess and remains a cautionary tale about what happens when ego, budget, and ambition collide without a compelling story to justify any of it. The Adventures of Pluto Nash, 2002. Eddie Murphy on the moon. That sentence alone should have been either genius or a complete disaster. Spoiler, it was the disaster option. The Adventures of Pluto Nash was a science fiction comedy set on a lunar colony in the year 2087, where Murphy plays a nightclub owner fighting off the mob. The film was actually shot in 2000, but sat on Warner Brothers' shelf for 2 years because the studio had zero confidence in it. They were right to worry. The production budget was roughly $100 million, an absurd figure for a comedy that looked like it was designed in a discount bin. When Warner Brothers finally released it in August 2002, the film opened to a jaw-dropping $2.8 million. Its total domestic gross was $4.4 million. Worldwide, it clawed its way to $7.1 million. Against the $100 million budget, that represented a loss of roughly $96 million before you even count marketing costs. Critics annihilated it. It holds a 5% on Rotten Tomatoes, making it one of the worst-reviewed studio comedies of all time. Murphy was coming off a string of hits and was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. This film didn't necessarily end his career, but it marked the beginning of a rough stretch that wouldn't fully recover for years. Rosario Dawson, Randy Quaid, Joe Pantoliano, and even Jay Moore showed up in supporting roles, and none of them could inject life into a script that felt dead on arrival. The film has become something of a legendary punchline in Hollywood, the go-to example of how spectacularly a star vehicle can implode. Stealth, 2005. Imagine pitching a movie where the villain is a rogue artificial intelligence fighter jet with a personality, and somehow getting $135 million to make it. That's Stealth. Directed by Rob Cohen, who had recently delivered The Fast and the Furious, Stealth followed 3 elite Navy pilots played by Josh Lucas, Jessica Biel, and Jamie Foxx as they deal with an AI-controlled drone that develops a mind of its own after getting struck by lightning. Yes, lightning gives a jet free will. That's the actual plot. Columbia Pictures and producer Mike Davis pushed forward with the project, banking on the star power of Fox, who was riding high on his Oscar win for Ray. The problem was that Fox's character dies midway through the film, eliminating the biggest draw for audiences. Critics were merciless, calling it Top Gun meets a screensaver with zero emotional depth. The film earned only $76 million worldwide against its $135 million budget, resulting in an estimated loss of around $96 million. It opened second at the domestic box office behind the comedy The Dukes of Hazzard, which tells you everything about where audiences' priorities were that weekend. Rob Cohen's stock as a blockbuster director plummeted. Biel and Lucas, despite being attractive and capable performers, couldn't anchor a blockbuster without a compelling story. The film became a symbol of mid-2000s Hollywood excess, where studios greenlit expensive, high-concept action movies that nobody asked for. Stealth is regularly cited in lists of the worst films of the decade, and watching it today feels like a time capsule of everything wrong with big-budget filmmaking in that era. John Carter, 2012. Disney spent $350 million making and marketing this film, and the American public responded with a collective, "What is a John Carter?" That vague, unmarketable title might be the single biggest branding failure in modern blockbuster history. The film was actually based on Edgar Rice Burroughs' beloved A Princess of Mars novels, which had influenced everything from Star Wars to Avatar. Director Andrew Stanton, the genius behind Finding Nemo and WALL-E, was making his live-action debut. Taylor Kitsch starred as the Civil War veteran transported to Mars. The source material was rich, the talent was legitimate, and the visuals were genuinely impressive. So what went wrong? Everything behind the scenes. Disney's marketing campaign was catastrophic. They dropped "of Mars" from the title because the studio believed Mars in a movie title was box office poison after the failure of Mars Needs Moms. They also dropped "Princess" to avoid alienating male audiences. What they were left with was a title that communicated absolutely nothing to anyone who wasn't already a fan of century-old pulp novels. The film opened to a dismal $30 million domestic. It earned $284 million worldwide, which sounds respectable until you stack it against that $350 million total cost. Disney reported a write-down of $200 million on the film. Studio chairman Rich Ross resigned shortly after. Kitsch's career as a leading man was essentially over before it started. Critics were genuinely divided, with many praising the world-building and action sequences, while noting the film felt decades too late, since every franchise it had originally inspired had already strip-mined its best ideas. John Carter is one of Hollywood's great what-ifs, a potentially fantastic franchise destroyed by incompetent marketing. Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas, 2003. DreamWorks Animation lost so much money on this film that Jeffrey Katzenberg publicly declared traditional 2D animation dead at his studio. Sinbad, voiced by Brad Pitt, was a lavish, hand-drawn animated adventure that combined classic mythology with buddy comedy. Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michelle Pfeiffer rounded out the voice cast. The animation was gorgeous, the action sequences were inventive, and the film had real personality. None of that mattered. The production budget was $60 million, and DreamWorks spent heavily on marketing. The film earned only $80 million worldwide, resulting in an estimated loss of around $125 million when all costs were tallied. That number is staggering, but the true damage went far deeper than finances. Katzenberg, the former Disney executive who had overseen The Lion King and other Renaissance-era classics, used Sinbad's failure as justification to permanently pivot DreamWorks Animation toward computer-generated films exclusively. The film essentially killed 2D animation at one of the only studios still championing it. Critics were reasonably positive, with many praising the fluid animation and Pfeiffer's deliciously fun villain performance as the goddess Eris. But audiences, particularly American families, had already moved on to Pixar and CG spectacles. Sinbad opened the same summer as Finding Nemo, and the contrast in audience enthusiasm was devastating. Pitt later admitted he found voice acting isolating and unrewarding compared to live-action work. The film has gained a modest cult following over the years, with animation enthusiasts recognizing its artistry and lamenting what was lost when studios abandoned the hand-drawn form. Sinbad didn't just fail at the box office, it helped close a door on an entire art form. The Flash. 2023. Warner Brothers needed this to be a grand slam. Instead, it was the most expensive foul ball in superhero history. The Flash had spent nearly a decade in development chaos, cycling through directors, scripts, and studio regimes. When it finally arrived, directed by Andy Muschietti and starring Ezra Miller, it carried a production budget of roughly $220 million and a marketing campaign that pushed total costs past $400 million. Warner Brothers was positioning it as the crown jewel of the DC Extended Universe, a multiverse story that would bring back Michael Keaton's Batman and reset the entire franchise. Then reality intervened. Miller's very public legal troubles and erratic behavior dominated headlines throughout the film's promotion, making it nearly impossible for the studio to market its own leading star. The film opened to a disappointing $55 million domestic, well below even the most conservative projections. Its worldwide total stalled at $271 million. Against total costs of $400 million plus, The Flash represented an estimated loss of $274 million, making it one of the most devastating financial failures in cinema history. Critics were surprisingly warm toward certain elements, particularly Keaton's return and the emotional core of the story. But the CGI was heavily criticized, with the film's climactic battle featuring digital effects that audiences compared to a video game from 2005. The timing was brutal too. Audiences knew the entire DC universe was being rebooted under James Gunn's new vision, so investing emotionally in a film that was essentially resetting a continuity nobody cared about felt pointless. The Flash didn't just lose money. It became the definitive proof that the old DC Extended Universe had run out of goodwill, time, and audience patience simultaneously. So there you have it. 10 films that collectively lost well over $1 billion and destroyed careers, studios, and even entire animation styles. But here's what I want to know from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these bombs you actually enjoyed watching. Because let's be honest, some of these are guilty pleasures. And here's the real question. Does Hollywood ever actually learn from these disasters? Or are they already greenlighting the next $300 million catastrophe right now? Let me know your thoughts. You're A